The changes are significant, and in the 12 years I've been working in transport, I think we haven't seen a bigger change so far. Installing a tachograph will become mandatory. The obligation to have a tachograph will be extended from vehicles with a GVW of up to 3.5 tons to vehicles with a GVW of up to 2.5 tons. Once we limit the number of available hours during which a vehicle can operate, cover mileage, and therefore generate revenue, then if that amount of time decreases, it will turn out that we'll have less time to earn enough to cover all the costs. We know there are companies that, for example, in solo transport operations, use smaller van-type vehicles, pretending to be solo vehicles. They don't have tachographs.
Good morning and a very warm welcome to the podcast Transport Freight Forwarding Success. Today we're discussing an extremely important topic, the mobility package and the changes coming into force on the 1st of July. My guest today, and yours as well, is Paweł Kempa, Freight Forwarding Manager, who will guide us through the subject. Hi Paweł.
Hi Konrad. Hello everyone.
Would it be journalistic exaggeration if I said that on the 1st of July the old world of transport will die and a new one will be born, or is that going too far?
It's a bit of an exaggeration. However, the changes are significant. And as I said, in the 12 years I've been working in transport, I think we haven't seen a bigger change so far. And as far as I know, there hadn't been one before either.
If someone who has absolutely no interest in the transport industry were to learn just one key fact about these changes, what should it be? What exactly is the transport revolution that begins on the 1st of July?
In fact, the average person won't be heavily affected by this. Let me reassure you, you do not need to update your driving license. The same driving license category as for passenger cars will still allow you to drive van-type vehicles. However, after the 1st of July, installing a tachograph will become mandatory. The obligation to have a tachograph will be extended from vehicles with a GVW of up to 3.5 tons.
Can we imagine a situation where transport company owners who currently operate large fleets of van-type delivery vehicles with a GVW of up to 3.5 tons suddenly begin getting rid of those vehicles because they are no longer profitable? Until now, those vehicles could cover long distances very quickly because they were not restricted by the muzzle of tachograph regulations.
The answer to that question is complex. I'll try to explain it. First of all, some transport companies will certainly want to withdraw from the market for several reasons. Firstly, these changes mean additional complications. They require changes in the way the business is operated. Secondly, installing a tachograph in older delivery vehicles may turn out to be an unprofitable investment. That's because the newest vehicles are already factory prepared for tachograph installation, so it's enough just to fit the unit itself. But with older vehicles, there are more complications because the vehicle has to be adapted, and that involves high costs. I think we're talking about even 1,700 or even 2,000 euro. In the case of an entire fleet of older delivery vehicles, for example, 10 vehicles, this becomes a considerable expense, and the owner of such a company may start wondering whether they still want to continue in this business, especially since many of these carriers, and not many people realize this, are not involved exclusively in transport and have other businesses as well. Very often, owners of small transport companies also run a shop, provide some kind of services, and transport is just something they do on the side. The moment they face the dilemma, should they invest or not invest, together with dealing with regulations and additional driver training, they may simply decide, whoa, why would I bother with this? I'll just give up transport. Fuel was already expensive. Business was already difficult. I'll let it go.
Will this still be profitable at all? What do you think? Cost, I understand. So in that case, we can probably expect the second-hand market, vehicle exchanges and auctions, for example, to suddenly become flooded with these van-type vehicles up to 3.5 tons.
Yes, especially because those carriers who decide to stay in the transport sector will want to become more competitive, and they'll want to purchase smaller vehicles with a GVW of up to 2.5 tons. This is a new segment in road transport, a new service that until now did not really exist on a wide scale. That's because only vehicles up to 2.5 tons will be able to complete transport jobs within the same fast time frames as vans up to 3.5 tons, or maybe even faster. That's why, in order to increase their competitiveness, transport company owners will be getting rid of their vehicles up to 3.5 tons and acquiring vehicles up to 2.5 tons instead. And what's the difference? Well, they're simply smaller. These are vehicles such as the Renault Traffic. These are delivery vehicles, most often with a hard-sided body rather than a curtain-sided body. And because of that hard-sided construction, they are naturally much more capable of maintaining typical motorway speeds that we normally associate with passenger cars, 120, 140 kilometers per hour, and even more when driving in Germany. 3.5-ton van-type delivery vehicles with curtain-sided bodies could theoretically probably accelerate to 150 kilometers per hour, but realistically nobody in their right mind would attempt that. So these vehicles up to 2.5 tons, because they won't require tachographs and because of the way they are built, will simply be able to travel even faster than 3.5-ton vans.
But another important point is not only that these vehicles travel fast, they can also reach virtually anywhere, because this is still a vehicle that can enter city centers, unless, of course, there are restrictions that also apply to passenger cars. But generally speaking, these vehicles can, in quotation marks, park anywhere.
Yes, although the 3.5-ton vans already had very impressive capabilities, we would really have to be dealing with an exceptionally narrow road somewhere in the Italian mountains for that vehicle not to be able to get through.
You know what interests me? Well, what do customers think about all this? How are they going to react? Do you think they are even aware of these changes?
I'm afraid that customer awareness may still be fairly limited.
On a scale from 1 to 10, okay?
It's difficult to judge, let's say 5 out of 10.
So we may encounter someone who suddenly wakes up on the 1st of July completely unprepared and discovers that the transport company they've been working with tells them that what exactly will they tell them? What is going to change, okay?
We'll say that we're moving forward. And as I mentioned at the beginning, these changes primarily affect carriers and the way they organize their work. And we will make every effort to ensure that it is as unnoticeable as possible for the customer. We will do everything we can to make it as unnoticeable as possible.
We'll talk about specifics in a moment, because it would be good to discuss concrete solutions as well. But for a customer who has regularly been ordering transport using van-type vehicles up to 3.5 tons, what exactly is going to happen now? Will they have to plan their transports differently? What will it look like from their perspective?
However, the customer must be aware of a few minor things that will affect the way they plan their transport operations.
All right, I'll count them. First one.
The first issue is the amount and dimensions of cargo that can be loaded onto a vehicle operating without a tachograph and which is capable of completing certain transports faster. Up until now, the limit was around 1,000 kilograms in the case of vehicles up to 3.5 tons and from 8 to 10 euro pallets, most commonly with a loading height of around 2.5 meters.
One now.
Now, of course, this will also depend on the body configuration of such a vehicle. The market is already beginning to respond, and different types of vehicle constructions are starting to appear. But in our case, it will be around 3 euro pallets, 500 kilograms, and approximately 130 centimeters in height.
Okay, so basically more of these vehicles will need to be dispatched, assuming that the van was already fully loaded before and that cargo space used to be sufficient, or...
Well, this is exactly what will need to be considered, because if a customer has so far been shipping one pallet weighing 100 kilograms, then practically nothing changes for them. They will still be able to ship it within the same time frame or even faster. But if we are talking closer to 8 pallets and around 1 ton, then they will have to start considering what to do, either send 2 or even 3 smaller vehicles, for example, if ultra express delivery is important to them, or perhaps send the most important part of the cargo in a smaller vehicle and the rest in a larger one. Or alternatively, if the customer has that possibility, wait a little longer until more cargo accumulates and then send it using a solo truck, for example.
I also think the role of transport service providers is going to change somewhat, because now another question arises. Who will actually be responsible for selecting the correct vehicle for a given load? Do you expect transport companies themselves to become more educated and start planning which cargo should be sent using which vehicle? Or do you think this will become the responsibility of the transport service provider, with customers relying on professional guidance and consultancy?
Of course, we will provide guidance, but ultimately the final decision rests with the customer. Because in certain cases, as I mentioned, nothing will change. Let's take an example of a shipment from Birmingham to Antwerp in Belgium. In that case, with or without a tachograph, a van, and practically every type of transport vehicle will still be able to make it. Assuming, of course, that there are no major complications on the way. It is still possible to complete that transport overnight, from one day to the next. In that situation, the customer will not really feel any difference. Nothing changes. The issue begins when the distance starts becoming greater. Greater meaning above 1,000, 1,200 kilometers. At that point, even a van. It's worth mentioning here because someone might think I'm contradicting myself. 1,200 kilometers overnight for a tachograph equipped vehicle would normally be almost impossible. And yes, that's true. But in the case of vans up to 3.5 tons, and I mean specifically those up to 3.5 tons, they will have tachographs, but they will not have the same speed restrictions as
Larger vehicles.
solo trucks or, for example, tractor units with semi-trailers. That means they will not be limited to 90 kilometers per hour. Instead, they will still be able to drive at 110 or 120 kilometers per hour without any problem. And on routes like that, increasing the average speed by 20 kilometers per hour genuinely shortens the transport time. Nevertheless, 1,200 kilometers already becomes very borderline. If we encounter
Traffic jams.
or any kind of complications on the route. And unfortunately, we all know what transport operations look like. A vehicle does not always arrive and get loaded 5 minutes after entering the site. Very often, loading only begins several hours later. So for vehicles equipped with tachographs, it's not only driving time that matters, but also total working time. Meaning that if a driver spends 8 hours waiting to be loaded, then afterwards they can no longer make up for that time by driving overnight like they used to, because their working time has already started. The clock has already been ticking, and at that point they may only have a few driving hours left for the evening. And in situations like that, completing such transports overnight simply becomes impossible. Then the customer commissioning that kind of route will have to decide whether they prefer to accept that the shipment will arrive, for example, one day later, or whether they want to look for another solution.
So to sum it up, we can probably say this: alongside tractor units with semi-trailers, alongside solo truck, and alongside the existing vans up to 3.5 tons, we will now also see these 2.5 ton vehicles entering the market. There will essentially be a broader range of options available. Of course, some effort will be required to optimize everything properly, but more choice means more possibilities, and credit should probably go to those companies investing in this entire new segment. And that's probably quite an investment as well.
I wouldn't necessarily say this creates more possibilities. I mean, I did say that these vehicles up to 2.5 tons will be slightly faster, certainly because they can simply travel at higher speeds. But overall, I would treat this more as a limitation rather than an expansion of possibilities. What's important in all of this is that these regulations definitely will not make any of these transport types completely pointless.
Apparently, drivers who are going to operate vehicles up to 2.5 tons are actually quite satisfied because, firstly, Only a Category B driving license is required, which many people already have. Secondly, overnight stays will often take place in hotels rather than inside the vehicle itself, because these vehicles simply do not have enough space for sleeping accommodation, unless of course there are some unusual vehicle designs. You're smiling.
Yes, there are some unusual vehicle designs appearing.
I'm waiting, Paweł, to hear what you're about to say.
In our company, we decided on the first option you mentioned, overnight stays in hotels, because space inside this type of vehicle is extremely limited. We concluded that in such situations, the driver must have the possibility to sleep in decent conditions, and that's why we chose hotel accommodation.
But
Everyone who follows industry portals and transport news already knows that miniature curtain-sided vans are also starting to appear on the market. They almost look like toys. They have a tiny cargo compartment at the back and a very small cab, where some manufacturers have even attempted to fit sleeping space for drivers.
terrifying.
In a way, yes.
You know what? That silence of yours and that longer moment of hesitation already says a lot by itself. It's genuinely hard to even imagine that kind of space and working environment. After all, a driver's uninterrupted trip often lasts for many days.
For me, this is yet another indication that we still don't really know what this sector of transport will ultimately look like. Right now, people have ambitious plans and are introducing different solutions, but we still don't know whether in the long term there will actually be drivers willing to spend their lives in these kinds of inventions. It's also unclear how widely this type of transport will be adopted and how many of these vehicles will ultimately end up on the market. But I'm convinced that they will definitely appear. We don't know how much of the transport that has so far been carried out using delivery vehicles up to 3.5 tons will remain within that segment, how much will shift to 2.5 ton vehicles, and how much will move into solo trucks or become partial loads on semi-trailers.
Paweł, now I'm going to ask you a difficult question, because it probably won't be pleasant trying to explain someone else's decisions. But who is ultimately going to bear the costs of introducing the mobility package changes?
At this point, the only honest answer is it's difficult to say, because basic logic tells us the following. If we have a certain number of vehicles with fixed operating costs, including insurance, leasing, repairs, depreciation, driver costs, and fuel costs, then the moment we reduce the number of available hours during which those vehicles are able to move, cover mileage, and therefore generate revenue, if that available operating time decreases, then it turns out we have less time to earn enough to cover all those costs. And as a consequence, the unit price of transport services should logically increase. Well, it should increase, but transport does not really work that way. Everyone assumes that if fuel prices rise or road tolls increase, then transport costs will automatically go up. But that's not always the case. Sometimes, even though the prices of different components of the service increase, transport rates themselves barely change. Sometimes they may even decrease.
How is that even possible?
Because in the transport market, just like in any other market, supply and demand are what ultimately decide everything. So if demand for transport is high and there are not enough vehicles available on the market, then transport prices rise. They can rise even if fuel prices are actually falling at the same time. But if the market slows down and overall demand for transport decreases while the number of vehicles on the market remains the same, then every player still wants to earn money. So they lower prices regardless of whether fuel prices are going up or down.
But surely certain pathologies will appear on the market. and probably already exist. I'm talking about the gray market because we constantly hear stories about vehicles being stopped for exceeding their permitted weight limits or all sorts of other situations involving insurance issues and similar problems. How do you think these changes will affect the gray market overall? Will it become even larger? Will 3.5-ton vehicles continue driving without tachographs, hoping they simply won't get caught? What are your predictions?
The gray market has always existed, still exists, and always will exist. The real question is simply how large it will become. With the introduction of these new regulations, on the one hand, there are factors suggesting that the gray market could grow, while on the other hand, there are also factors suggesting that it could actually decrease. How it will ultimately develop, we simply do not know. At this moment, however, we already know that there are companies which, for example, in solo truck transport operations, use van-type vehicles pretending to be solo trucks. They don't have tachographs. It is a frightening practice. In my opinion, it should not exist for many reasons. But from the customer's perspective, the biggest issue is the enormous risk involved in the event of an accident or even during a roadside inspection.
And let's look at a specific example. Let's assume such an overloaded vehicle pretending to be a solo truck gets involved in an accident. From the customer's perspective, is there even any chance of obtaining compensation?
This is probably something I would rather hand over to an insurance specialist because it certainly depends on many specific circumstances surrounding a particular case. What is certain, however, is that it is not a hopeless situation where absolutely nothing can be done from the outset.
And even if compensation is eventually paid out, the money probably won't arrive immediately. From the carrier's perspective, the vehicle is out of operation, the cargo may be damaged, nobody knows when the compensation will actually be paid.
Exactly. And above all, there is massive uncertainty involved, especially when we are not transporting potatoes, but goods worth hundreds of thousands of euro, because suddenly we are faced with the question, will compensation actually be paid out or not? And if not, then the question becomes whether that particular carrier will even be capable of covering the damages out of their own pocket.
And in the second scenario, where a vehicle gets stopped for inspection and it turns out that something is not compliant, how does the customer experience that situation?
This can become especially unpleasant because in express transport, the customer usually has a very serious reason why time matters so much. It could be the threat of a production shutdown. For example, a very expensive production machine may have broken down and it absolutely has to keep running. And in that situation, every single hour matters. If such a vehicle gets caught and detained, it can generate delays lasting many hours
Several days.
or potentially even several days in the delivery of that critical cargo or spare part for the machine. That's why it is extremely important to be aware that this kind of practice exists and to work only with companies where we have complete confidence that they operate in accordance with the rules.
And how can someone verify whether a transport company is trustworthy? Are there any green flags we can mention here?
What I'm about to say may sound unbelievable nowadays, but one positive sign can simply be a properly functioning company website or even an email signature that doesn't fall apart visually. Those are already the first indications that we may be dealing with a reliable company that approaches business seriously. But jokes aside, although unfortunately this is not really a joke, we should choose companies with an established market position, companies that have major clients and major partners in their portfolio, and companies that can demonstrate certification such as ISO certification. Those are definitely very good signs. Transport has always faced challenges.
Great. So now that we understand what these changes mean and that strange vehicles with miniature micro apartments for sleeping may start appearing, and we also understand what this may mean for customers, the bigger question is how these changes will interact with all the other changes that are completely outside our control. And by that I mean geopolitical changes. Large-scale macroeconomics has a massive impact on transport. You mentioned that you've worked in transport for 12 years, so you probably remember many situations where some kind of crisis happened, a war broke out, fuel prices suddenly skyrocketed, and so on. How do you see the future of transport overall? Recently, there has been a lot of discussion about transport companies, especially Polish companies, going bankrupt. I think it was around 1,000 companies in the first quarter of this year alone. And these are mainly small businesses because it's a very sensitive market.
If we really think about it, every single period had its own difficulties. And if we spoke with freight forwarders from those years, each one of them could point to different issues. We could probably record a separate podcast about the situation in 2015, 16, 17, and every single year after that. Transport is a sector that has one very important advantage. It is safe in the sense that it will definitely not disappear. Nowadays, with the rapid development of artificial intelligence, people working in many professions are beginning to wonder what awaits them and what the future will look like. And of course, transport will also be affected by these changes, but it certainly will not disappear completely. I am convinced that we will never reach a level of optimization where transport is no longer necessary.
And that's exactly what's interesting, because everywhere you look in the media, you hear the same message. Polish carriers are shutting down their businesses. There is a shortage of drivers on the market, and on top of that, more regulations are coming in. Companies will have to invest in tachographs. It's a lot to deal with.
There's actually a quote from Game of Thrones that comes to mind here. It's a slightly forgotten series now, but still an interesting one. There was a very charismatic character called Littlefinger. At one point he said, chaos is a ladder, and that quote can very easily be applied to transport, where different things are always happening, different crises are constantly appearing, and the whole industry is highly dynamic. But just because we are experiencing some kind of crisis at a given moment does not mean that everyone automatically loses, that nothing can be done, and that everyone will go bankrupt and the world will end. That's simply not how it works. Some companies will know how to use the situation and turn it to their advantage, while others won't. That's business. In every such crisis, we try to manage and plan things in a way that makes the impact on our customers as unnoticeable as possible, and so that we are still able to deliver our services even during periods of global uncertainty.
I don't know whether anyone watches YouTube videos or listens to Spotify podcasts from the end backwards, but I'll try to summarize everything we've discussed here, just in case someone actually does that. Half joking, half serious, but if we put all of this together, then the situation looks something like this. On the 1st of July, tachographs will appear in vans up to 3.5 tons, unless, of course, someone operates in the grey market, and we already know how to recognize companies that are probably not part of that grey market.
Sorry to interrupt you here, but I've just realized that we missed an important topic. We started talking about companies operating in the grey market. As I mentioned earlier, one could get the impression that this grey market will eventually have no choice but to change and evolve somehow. But actually, that is not entirely certain, because many companies, in fact, almost everyone, expects that together with the introduction of the new regulations under the mobility package, vehicle inspections will become radically more intensive. And that's what we are hoping for. We hope that these dishonest companies will now face much greater difficulties, and that operating outside the rules will simply stop being profitable for them.
I'm glad you brought that up, because it sounds very reasonable, and it's difficult to imagine that anyone would simply turn a blind eye to these issues. This market has to operate according to fair rules. I appreciate you mentioning that. Coming back to the summary, we now more or less understand what is going to happen operationally. We also understand what the mobility package means for customers. We can expect support from transport and freight forwarding companies, which will help customers figure out how to continue organizing transport under slightly different conditions, but in a way that remains as unnoticeable as possible. We also talked about costs and pricing. You mentioned the law of supply and demand. I'm not sure whether that was your way of diplomatically avoiding a direct answer about whether prices will change. But honestly, it sounded very reasonable to me. We'll see what happens. It truly is a huge unknown at this stage. And that brings me to my final question. How long do you think it will take for the situation to stabilize?
That's a good question. To be honest, I haven't really had time to think about it properly yet.
Just a quick, spontaneous answer.
Speaking spontaneously, I think it will take around 1 year, somewhere between 6 months and 1 year, because we have to take into account the way carriers will adapt to these changes. And naturally, in order to adapt, companies first need to observe how the market reacts, then make specific decisions, and only afterwards carry out larger fleet purchases, for example. Expanding a fleet can easily become a process lasting anywhere from several months to a full year.
Paweł, before we finish, I'd like you to say a few final words directly to our viewers, either something reassuring or perhaps something that draws attention to certain risks. Will it be more of a warning or more reassuring?
Again, that's a difficult question, but personally, I would rather remain optimistic because I believe that every such regulatory improvement, every tightening of the rules, and every step that reduces the gray market may seem inconvenient to some people in the short term. In isolated situations, it may turn out, for example, that transport becomes more expensive. But in the longer perspective, the so-called long game, it will prove beneficial both for honest transport companies and for the customers using their services, because it eliminates many problematic and costly situations for everyone involved.
And with that thought, we leave you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Paweł, for the conversation. And thank you as well to all of you for spending these last several dozen minutes with us. We'll see you in the next episode of the Transport Freight Forwarding Success podcast. I would also strongly encourage you to take a look at our previous materials because many of the topics discussed in our earlier conversations are still highly relevant today, and some of the predictions we made actually came true faster than anyone expected. We're talking here about forecasts concerning the transport market and developments in the world of technological innovation. But not only that, in other words, we warmly invite you to join us for future episodes. Once again, thank you, Paweł, and
Thanks, Conrad. Thank you.
see you next time.